Hey everyone, I'm Miguel Maravilla with FightNews.com and SouthernCaliforniaBoxing.com. Here introducing myself to you all. I'm going to bring this weekly segment, maybe about 2-3 times a week, just depending on how much action we get, how much fights, how much stories, how much press conference, scoop, you name it. But that's the plan, to bring you more info on this channel. Want to give you a brief background about myself. I myself began as a boxing fan. Obviously, like most of you out there, I uh, I had a passion for it ever since I was a kid. I always liked the competition of it. My uncles watching boxing fights, some of the old school boxing fights, and as I got older, I just noticed there was boxing pay-per-views similar to like what there is with wrestling. So some of those fights were the late '80s, early '90s Mike Tyson fights, the Julio Cesar Chavez fights. Going to a family party or a fight party, whatever you name it. You'd go there and the house would be packed for the Chavez fight. Tons of people in the house for the pay-per-view party. So that's when I began the passion. I also began boxing as an amateur. I had an amateur stint from about 1993, 94 to about 2000, 2001. So in that stint, lots of experience. I did numerous rounds of sparring, had some fights. Then one of my sparring partners, we were stable mates at the Commerce Boxing Gym here in Commerce, was Francisco Panchito Bojado, the 2000 Mexican Olympian. We used to spar together as kids from 11, 10 years old to about 13, 14. Once he started competing in major international tournaments, and I did my own thing. I would box, but I would also play high school sports. But anyways, just that's how I began my passion for boxing. Watching these fights, and before I started boxing as an amateur, I actually used to read a lot of the Ring magazine. Read it on a monthly basis, get the subscription, go to the library, the local library here in my neighborhood, and just wait for that new subscription to come out, read it, uh, look into whatever there is, whatever scoop there was. And along the way also there was La Opinion. La Opinion here in LA it's the major Spanish, newspaper. So there was a lot of boxing coverage that La Opinion provided. Thank La Opinion, and most particularly thank former boxing writer for La Opinion, Ramiro Gonzalez. Because of him, I gained all this knowledge as far as the local scenery, the Southern California, the Mexican scenery, national, as well as the worldwide boxing circuit. He provided a lot of coverage, kept everyone informed on certain fighters, upcoming fight schedules, and what I enjoyed the most from his boxing column, he had this thing called ganchos y jabs, hooks and jabs, and all it was just scoop. It was I believe it was like maybe once or twice a week that he put it up, and it provided all the scoop notes, you name it. Then there was in the late '90s, you had the internet age coming up. The website that I'm currently with right now, FightNews.com, they began in the late '90s, and they're informative as far as their coverage goes. They give you quick bout reports. If you have a favorite fighter that's not fighting on the televised card, but you want to know what's happening, this is before streams. And right now to this day, we provide a quick recap on what happened with that fight that takes place at 1:30, 2 p.m. I myself am there from the first bout to the last bout, ringside, by the way. So that's just to give you an idea. But anyways, going back to to the websites. You know, you had other websites too. You had Boxing Scene, Max Boxing, Boxing Talk, Seconds Out. These were some of the websites that were out in the early 2000s. Credit to boxing writers, longtime boxing writers, Doug Fisher and Steve Kim. You know, going to college, going to school. There was times when I would be done with work, with my homework, you name it, studying. I had another hour to kill in between classes, so I'd always log on to some of their stuff. So much thanks to them for informing me throughout the years, and of course, you know, through the years, I worked my way to the business. I began covering boxing for Fight News in 2011, where here I am to this day. Some of the biggest, some of the fights that I've covered in the past since 2011, you know, they're right here on my credential wall. Some of the fights have included, you know, the Mayweather Canelo, Mayweather Pacquiao, both Canelo Triple G, Wilder Fury, Canelo at a Cowboy Stadium. The list goes on and on. Any major fight you could think of since 2011, a majority I was that was in Southern California. I covered Las Vegas, and occasionally some fights in Texas and New York. The major fights, of course, depending on what Southern California fighter, what local fighter is fighting. And you know, here I am to provide you this segment, this weekly segment, this channel. So feel free to fire away, whether you agree with me or disagree with me. Comment. Give me a follow on Twitter at Miguel Maravilla. Well, check at the end of the screen. You'll be able to get all that information at Miguel Maravilla. So, with that said, I want to go ahead and talk to you about today's, most of the week's news. What's going on in boxing? The big news coming out of San Diego here, coming out of Southern California, we have former heavyweight champion Andy Ruiz joins Team Canelo as he hooks up with trainer Eddie Reynoso. They'll pair up, and hopefully, you know, something transpires here. The only issue there, not issue, but the main factor there going into that camp will be, what does Andy Ruiz bring to that stable in terms? Is he going to be disciplined? Is he going to be able to, hold his own and just be disciplined, focus? Of course, there's what happened in the rematch with Joshua. He wasn't focused. He wasn't training hard, etc., etc. Taking nothing away from trainer Manny Robles, I think he's one of the better trainers out there that's coming up in the sport. However, there are times when, as a term goes, or as a saying goes, this has ran its course. Maybe that's what happened in the case with Manny Robles and uh, Andy Ruiz. However, now he joins a stable, a solid stable of Eddie Reynoso, Team Canelo, which includes Mexican superstar Saul Canelo Alvarez. It also includes former world champion, super featherweight Oscar Valdez, former champion Luis Neri, current champion Julio Cesar Martinez, and of course Ryan Garcia. So Reynoso himself, he brings in another fast-handed fighter, fast-handed Andy Ruiz. Yes, being a heavyweight, he is as fast-handed as they come for a heavyweight. My first time actually watching him, I believe he was making his debut, if I'm not mistaken, or he was. Yeah, I think he was making his debut. Must have been fighting at the Forum. Anyways, I had interviewed him already. I talked to him. He goes up to the ring to do his shadow boxing, to do his his workout for the cameras. And in the meantime, I'm below the ring talking to somebody else. It must have been I don't remember who the fighter was. And all of a sudden, you hear the punches go off. You hear the hands going, hitting the pads, hitting the mitts. And it was wow. That was some sight to see. Andy Ruiz just unload and let his hands go was quite a sight. Watching him for the first time. So let's see what happens there with that hookup, with that duel. I like the pairing between Reynoso and Ruiz. So we'll see what happens next, and we'll see who the first fight between the duel will be. Moving on, also rest in peace to Jimmy Glenn. Jimmy Glenn's a former cutman, former cornerman. He was also the owner of Jimmy's Corner in New York. Jimmy's Corner was a few blocks away from Times Square. I was actually in Times Square, and if you're a boxing fan, that's one place you want to visit. If you go to New York, you're there for a fight. Stop by Jimmy's Corner. I'm sure you can stop by and still pay your respects. Uh, as far as Jimmy's Corner goes, the bar itself, you walk in there and it's all boxing. It's a boxing bar, all boxing memorabilia everywhere. I want to talk to you about my first time uh, at Jimmy's Corner. So the first time in New York, I was there for Golovkin Lemieux that weekend. So the first night there, I'm like, okay, I'm tired. Just want to go to bed. I ended up taking that picture in Times Square. So I yelped. I must have yelped it, or I must have came. Yeah, I think I yelped it. So it's at Jimmy's Corner, and I saw the reviews. This is a good spot, great hangout, good vibe. So I decided to walk. So then, as I get there, I noticed that there's boxing gloves. I was like, "Oh, sweet! This is a boxing theme bar." As I walk in, it's crowded. It's a small bar too, but there's just memorabilia everywhere. You have, I believe, there's a bow from Madison Square Garden, one of the original bows, I believe. Right there as you walk into the bar, and then there's a picture of Roberto Duran, and then there's a bunch of other posters and fight posters, pictures. So there's these guys next to me. They're talking boxing, and suddenly I have to go to the head, go to the restroom. So I walk over to the restroom, and the restroom is all the way to the back. So as you walk, you're like bumping into people. Excuse me. You're trying to get through. So as you get to the back, there's like this open space, and there's more memorabilia, more fight posters. Suddenly, I see Doug Fisher and Steve Kim, and then Doug tells me, "Hey, you made it here. This is always a place to come to. I don't see you here in the East Coast, much too often." But I myself did not even know that was a boxing landmark in terms of going there, having a drink, and talking boxing. So it was a great place. The first experience there was a great experience, fun experience. And to this day, every time I go to New York to cover a fight, make sure I stop by. I always make sure I stop by at Jimmy's Corner, just to it's a tradition for me now. So I look forward to going to Jimmy's Corner once again. And rest in peace to Jimmy Glenn, a great cutman, great boxing manager, managed many of the many fighters. He himself worked many corners of many fighters. So may he rest in peace, and condolences to his family. The next topic. So Oscar De La Hoya was interviewed in a podcast, and he stated that he would finish off McGregor in 2 rounds, something like that. He had mentioned, and it was the podcast. I believe it was on CBS Sports. It was a CBS Sports podcast, and he's He's talking that pretty much he would beat Mayweather. Not that he officially issued a challenge. Not that he said, "Hey, I want you, Conor McGregor. Let's step into the ring." No, it must have been a question that they asked him, and he just went off of it and so forth. So Conor McGregor went on and he posted on Twitter, Oscar, he accepted the challenge, so forth. So Oscar responded by, "Hey, you know, I never issued a challenge, but he'll pretty much saying that, hey, I never issued you a challenge, but I'll still knock you out." So that's created some buzz here in the world of boxing. Everyone on Twitter is going crazy. Again, this is how the Mayweather McGregor fight began with just some ramblings on the airwaves. So we'll see what happens with De La Hoya McGregor, as De La Hoya hasn't fought since he was stopped by Pacquiao, and McGregor, on the other hand, he's been active. He's been in the ring with Mayweather, as far as the boxing ring, only with Mayweather. We'll see what transpires. We'll see. On to that, I believe Mike Tyson was offered $1 million to fight in Australia. If I'm not mistaken, he was offered to fight, or he's been offered to fight Danny Williams. The guy that beat him back in, I believe it was 2003. If I'm not mistaken, 2003. So it was, good for Tyson. His video went viral last week of him, just hitting the mitts. So let's wish Mike the best. Let's see if he gets a future date in the ring. Also, today is today marks, I believe, 16 years the first Pacquiao Marquez fight. Yes, that was actually that was televised the other day on ESPN. So it was good to watch that fight. Reminisce, recap. I remember watching that fight. Kid you not, that fight, I honestly thought that Marquez was done after that first knockdown. If you remember, he was knocked down 3 times in the first round. The first two were a bit flashy knockdowns, but the third time he went down, he went down pretty bad. And then when he went down, he basically put his gloves over our hands. And like I said, I thought he was done. That looked like, to me, that looked like a defeated fighter. But he's able to get up, uh, survive the round, and the rest is history. The next 40 some rounds are history. So that created a rivalry between the two. They went on to fight 4 times. There was 4 fights in their rivalry. But on to another fight. Um, Yesterday was also 15 years the battle between Diego Corrales and Jose Luis Castillo. As you remember that fight, Castillo had knocked down Corrales. Corrales was already spitting out his mouthpiece. Corrales' eye was puffed. He looked, he looked like a beat up fighter. And all of a sudden, the tables turned when Corrales on the inside catches Castillo, and next thing you know, he wails away. He's on the attack, and the fight's over. So that was one of the memorable bouts of the 2000s decade, century, you could say. But onto the ESPN 5 hours of boxing that they showed the other day on ESPN News. It started off with Morales Barrera 1. That I can remember that fight. I anticipated that to be a good fight. I was at a party. That was my senior year in high school. I was at a party. Next, I'm like, I gotta get out of here. So I told a few of my friends, because I don't want to tell everybody at the party, like, hey, I'm gonna split. But I remember just saying, hey, dude, I'm gonna get out of here because I'm gonna go watch that Morales and Barrera fight. And of course, my friends started, they started clowning me. They started telling everybody, he has to go home. It's his curfew. Because once I got home, there was no way I could say, all right, fight's over. I'm going back to the party. No, that was it. You're home. You're home. So I get home, and what I witnessed was a classic. Was a classic fight, as Morales and Barreras gave us 12 rounds, and they went on to give us 24 more rounds as the two went on to fight a pair of fights. So that's been one of the biggest rivalries and some of the classic fights in the 2000s. Then, of course, as I mentioned, the Pacquiao Marquez first fight, that was followed by the Miguel Cotto Antonio Margarito fight. Margarito ended up stopping Cotto late in the 11th. Say what you want about Margarito, yes, he was caught, or his trainer was caught in the following fight in the dressing room as he was preparing to take on Mosley, and then the jury was out. Did he use it? But if you see the first fight and the second fight, a lot of similarities. Cotto was starting to back up in the second fight, but anyways, that was the fight. Cotto ended up avenging that defeat, that 2008 defeat 3 years later. So that was another rivalry, and then there was De La Hoya Chavez one. That fight, I remember that fight. That fight you can only watch. You could only watch that fight via closed circuit, not on pay per view. You couldn't order it. We had the black box. I remember after, we us having a black box, and then all of a sudden we remember we couldn't watch that fight. But yes, we had a black box. So all the pay per views I watched before, they were ripping off the promoters. So uh, Don King Promotions, Top Rank, hey, hard times. We weren't going to pay that much money for a pay per view, but hey, it is what it is. But anyways, I remember watching that fight in closed circuit. My uncle ended up winning tickets to go watch that fight. You had to go to a venue to pay $35 to go watch it on closed circuit. We're talking a venue, sports arena, the Forum, the Arrowhead Pond, which is now the Honda Center, the Rose Bowl, big sporting venues to go watch it on a big screen. So my uncle ends up winning tickets to go watch it at Cal State Fullerton at a football stadium. And all of a sudden, my mom's like, okay, I got to scramble. I got to do something. So the day of the fight, my mom, she went ahead and she took me to the Ticketmaster outlet, which was, I want to say it was Music Plus or Blockbuster. I don't remember what it was called, or the warehouse. I don't remember. But we go and she buys me the ticket. It was a $35 ticket. So I remember watching that fight, what it lasted. But there were some good fights in the parking lot and in the stands following the De La Hoya Chavez fight, right there at the closed circuit viewing. Then those 5 hours of boxing concluded with Pacquiao Marquez 4 with the knockout victory that sealed the deal for Marquez in that rivalry. Again, that was a Cinco de Mayo marathon. Now, in terms of Cinco de Mayo and boxing, it's become a tradition now. Anytime it's Cinco de Mayo or Cinco de Mayo weekend, bam, there has to be a fight. So as long as I can remember, the first there was a pay per view in, I believe, on this date today. It was Don King had a pay per view which featured. It wasn't a Cinco de Mayo theme. It wasn't. But Chavez was on the undercard. He was fighting Terrence Ali. Stopped Terrence Ali. Ali, a very fun fighter to watch. Very fun fighter to watch. And then also that main event was Lennox Lewis. He wanted to he decision Tony Tucker in the main event. So that was a Cinco de Mayo. But again, it wasn't a Cinco de Mayo theme. There wasn't no Tecate rebate or a, you know Cinco de Mayo Mexican theme for that. So then the following year, And correct me if I'm wrong, there probably was other pay-per-views before that or other fight cards on Cinco de Mayo. Chavez probably did fight on Cinco de Mayo weekend before that, but in terms of glorifying the event, making it marketable, May 1994, May 7th, I want to say, you have Revenge the Rematches pay-per-view. That was headlined by Julio Cesar Chavez taking on Frankie Randall in the rematch because obviously the theme was revenge. Chavez needed his revenge. Chavez had suffered his first defeat about 5 months prior at the MGM Grand to Frankie Randall. Randall knocked him down in that fight, gave him everything he could handle, and ended up pulling a split decision. So all of a sudden, Don King decides, hey, let's make a pay-per-view for Cinco de Mayo weekend. And at that time, when the fight was announced, I mean, I could just remember myself and many other Mexicans, Mexican Americans, you name it, Chavez fans, just mentioning, okay, just thinking, wow, Chavez is going to win Cinco de Mayo weekend. He's fighting Cinco de Mayo weekend. There's no way he loses. So we're gonna go up. We're gonna watch the fight. He's gonna win. So that card was dubbed as Revenge the Rematches. Opening the card was Jesse James Leija. He defeated Azuma Nelson. They had fought a few months before, and Leija was jobbed of that decision. So sweet revenge it was. Then you had Terry Norris defeating Simon Brown by a unanimous decision, as Simon Brown had brutally stopped Terry Norris a few months before, also in Mexico, stopped him in his tracks. And what I mean by that, Terry Norris was talked about being a potential opponent for Julio Cesar Chavez. And, there were some big fights talked about for Terry Norris. And all of a sudden, he meets Simon Brown, and that went out the window. So he ended up getting his sweet revenge. The only I remember the only fight where Sweet Revenge did not take place was Gerald McClellan stopping Julian the Hawk Jackson in the opening round, and then all of a sudden we have the rematch between Chavez and Randall, and that fight that was Randall proved that the first fight was no fluke. He buckled Chavez in the second round, and Chavez, as always, going at Randall, giving Randall, hitting him with everything he had, going to the body, and then suddenly there's a clash of heads, and they go to the scorecards. Chavez ends up winning a technical decision and regaining his title. However, you can tell Chavez wasn't satisfied winning in that way. He was not satisfied with a technical decision, uh, but it is what it is. The the two ended up fighting again years later in Mexico, but this time, I mean, both were past their prime. But Chavez took it to him. So that was 1994. In 1995, the pay per view, the Cinco de Mayo pay per view in '95 was La Batalla. That was when Rafael Ruelas and Oscar De La Hoya squared off. Ruelas, the IBF lightweight champion, De La Hoya, the WBO lightweight champion. De La Hoya stops him in two. That was a fight where I thought, and everybody thought, okay, Ruelas is going to give him a tough. He's going to give him a tough. We thought Oscar for sure was going to come out of that fight with bruised up, cuts, bleeding, and all, but instead, to a surprise, he stopped him quick. On that same undercard, Johnny Tapia was on that undercard. Gabriel Ruelas defeated Jimmy Garcia. Jimmy Garcia tragically passed away a few days later. Then I believe you had Mia St. John and Butterbean on that undercard, if I'm not mistaken. So that was La Batalla, top rank, 1995. 1996, Forum Boxing. Forum Boxing had a pay-per-view that was headlined by Marco Antonio Barrera defending his title. Barrera defended his title at the Arrowhead Pond, now the Honda Center. On that undercard, I believe Mark Too Sharp Johnson scored a first-round knockout. And then 96, I believe that weekend was supposed to be the Chavez De La Hoya. And that fight ended up getting pushed back to June. Then you had from '97. I can't recall who had fought in those years. I'm sure there was boxing. I'm sure it could have been Oscar. Uh, it could have been Julio. And then you have other years where there was fights. As I mentioned, the Corrales Castillo in 2004. That was Cinco de Mayo weekend. Pacquiao Marquez first. That was on Cinco de Mayo weekend. I know De La Hoya fought a few times on that weekend also. Then Mayweather ended up taking those dates, fighting, headlining some of those Cinco de Mayo cards against Mosley, against Maidana, Robert Guerrero, you name it. And now, of course, you have Canelo, Golovkin, mostly Canelo headlining those dates. So that's the Cinco de Mayo boxing tradition. That's what that's how it began. So again, correct me if I'm wrong. It's possible that there was other pay-per-views or major fights that took place, but in terms of what it is now, that's pretty much where it all began in those years. 94 was the first I can remember, the first major pay-per-view. Revenge, the rematches. Again, the theme was not Cinco de Mayo; it was revenge, the rematches. That was the theme. Moving on now, we uh, tonight, Telemundo, they'll be showcasing a documentary on Wilfredo Papito Vasquez Jr. That's former world champion and, of course, son of former world champ Wilfredo Vasquez of Puerto Rico. So that'll be tonight on Telemundo. Also, there's a boxing slowly starting to come back. I know a few weeks ago there was a fight card in Nicaragua, Managua, Nicaragua, at the Polideportivo Alexis Arguello. That was promoted by Rosendo Alvarez, Buffalo Promotions, former world champ Rosendo Alvarez. So props to him on promoting that card, hosting it. That's those are the signs, the first steps of you know, boxing starting to come back, and they'll also be promoting another card in the same venue next weekend, May 16th. Then the following week, May 23rd, in Mexico in Michoacan, former world champion Carlos Molina and Roy Jones Jr. They'll be promoting a card from Michoacan. So that's good news. Also, the following week, May 30th, there'll be a card in the Dominican Republic in Santo Domingo. That'll be promoted by Schwan Boxing, as there'll be a WBA Feda Latin title at stake, as super flyweights Norberto Jimenez takes on Eliser Aquino. Also, promoter Bob Arum mentioned that he wants to return. Hopefully, plans on returning in June. So let's see what transpires there. PBC as well as Matchroom Boxing, they've mentioned that possibly returning in July. Oscar De La Hoya's Golden Boy Promotions, he mentioned on Twitter that he wants to promote a card on 4th of July, at the actual 4th of July, which lands on a Saturday this year. So that's progress right there. We're hoping boxing is back soon. We're hoping there's action coming soon. That way we can all get our boxing fix. That way we could all, go back to our daily routines and normal lives. But until then, as I mentioned, hey, this this segment I'll be coming to you guys about 2-3 times a week, talking boxing, news, reports, you name it, recapping some of the weekend fights as well as previewing some of the fights coming up. So until then, follow me on Twitter at Miguel Maravilla, and also for the latest boxing information, news, notes, you name it, log on to fightnews.com and southerncaliforniaboxing.com. Until then, folks, we'll see you next time.